Okay, welcome to our third video. So last video we talked about the revolutions that had been going on in Latin America. We've also had some stuff going on in Europe, and that's going to be where we start today. So Europe had been undergoing some changes as well. Here are some things for you to keep in mind. There had been monarchies, and the monarchs claimed to have divine right to rule, but they had been overthrown. Then the Congress of Vienna attempted to restore the monarchies as well as the territorial divides that had been there before. They wanted to go back to the way that things had been long ago, and they were kind of successful in that. So for about the next 100 years, there was very little war between European countries. Now, there is a totally different story as far as what's going on within these countries. Okay. Remember when the Congress of Vienna met? They had a seating arrangement, right? Where conservatives sat together, liberals sat together, and radicals sat together. But what was it about these groups that made them so different? So you have two columns for each of these groups in your notes. In one column, write down who made up these groups. And in the other column, I want you to write down the political philosophies of these groups. The conservatives were the noble and the wealthy class. Their political philosophy was the government should be run by the traditional monarchies. They were all for the way things going back to the way they had been under absolutism. The liberals were made up of the middle class business leaders and merchants or business owners. This group definitely wanted parliaments to be elected and represent the nation's population. But they only wanted landowners and those who were fairly educated to be able to vote for the elected leaders. The third group, the radicals, were basically everyone else in society. They wanted major changes to be made and for democracy to be for all the people, not just the noble or wealthy classes. They also believed that governments should have the same ideals as the French Revolution, which were liberty, equality, and fraternity or brotherhood. Okay, so you already know the definition of nationalism. It's a feeling that people have of being loyal to and proud of their country. But there is more to it than just that. So remember that we're going to be adding on to this definition for the rest of the year. We will talk about nationalism in almost every single unit from here on out. Nationalism is also the idea that people's loyalty shouldn't only be to their country, specifically to a king or to an empire, but to the nation of people because they share a culture or history together. So this is going to make things a little more confusing for folks who have a rigid political philosophy like the conservatives and the liberals, because it is no longer about how much money one has or if one is educated, but rather more about a shared culture. There were a few nation states in Europe at this time, but not many. By 1815, the nation states of Europe were England, France, and Spain. Okay, so not a lot at all, but don't worry, it won't be long before there are others. So let's start with Greece. Greece was the first to win their own independence. On this map, you can see that the Ottoman Empire was quite large. It occupied parts of Asia, Africa. It was on the Arabian Peninsula as well. So if we were to name off the present-day countries that it had included, it would be Greece, Albania, Bulgaria, Romania, Turkey, part of the Ukraine, Serbia, and many others. It was due to this nationalist spirit that the Greeks were able to defeat the Ottoman Turks. In 1821, the Greeks demanded independence and they revolted. Greece had managed to maintain its own history and culture, and people around the world supported the idea of independence. Russian Orthodox Christians felt a connection to and supported the Greek Orthodox Christians. Educated Americans and Europeans loved and respected the ancient Greek culture. Think Aristotle, Socrates, okay? But not everybody was on board with this, though, such as the powerful governments in Europe. But as support for Greece grew amongst the people, it eventually results in powerful nations of Europe coming around to help the cause. In 1827, there was a battle called the Battle of Navarino, and it was during this battle when the Turkish and Egyptian forces were completely destroyed by the Greeks with the help of the Russian, British, and French fleets, their navies. Interesting fact, and you don't need to write this down, but the European fleets were hoping that just by showing up, they would be able to intimidate the Ottomans into fleeing. Well, the minute that they arrived, they were fired upon by the Ottomans, and then they had no choice but to fire back, which led to the Battle of Navarino. In 1830, France, Great Britain, and Russia all signed a treaty in agreement with Greece, or in agreement that Greece was an independent kingdom. Now, this is where things start to fall apart. So remember the Congress of Vienna? They met and basically agreed that things should go back to the way they used to be. They wanted the kings and queens and monarchies to return. Well, the way that they had set things up in Europe at that time, they all began to fall apart here. So by the 1830s, there were nationalist riots breaking out all over Europe, and liberals and radicals were openly and constantly attacking the conservative governments in place. For example, the Belgian Revolution. Belgians declared their independence from Dutch control in October of 1830. Let's see. Here we go. In Italian nationalists, they worked to unite all of Italy. And we'll talk more about that in video 4. But their goal was to have one unified Italy. In the late 1830s, Poles, that's what you call a Polish person, in case you didn't know that, you call them a Pole, P-O-L-E. Poles had revolted in Warsaw against Russian rule, and it took almost a year for the Russian forces to end the uprising. So these nationalist movements began to pop up all over Europe, but by the mid to late 1830s, it looked like conservatives had everything back under control and things were getting back to normal, but it will not be that way for long. So the nationalists in these European countries, they don't give up. And in 1848, there was a rash of revolutions that occur. However, here's your spoiler alert. They fail to unite. Okay, so let's find out what happened. In 1848, ethnic uprisings broke out all over Europe. So you should remember this guy. This is Prince Metternich. He was the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Austrian Empire, and he was responsible for having the Congress of Vienna in Vienna. And remember that he had 3 goals for the Congress of Vienna. He wanted to surround France with strong countries so France wouldn't become too powerful. He wanted to restore a balance of power so no country could become too powerful. And finally, he wanted to put monarchies back in place where Napoleon had swept through and conquered. He's not so big on this whole nationalism movement, so when these uprisings began in Italy, he sent troops to squash them. Eventually, there ends up being an uprising in Vienna. He became the target of an angry everyday citizens and their frustrations. So after an angry mob clashed with police in the streets of Vienna, Metternich was forced to resign and he went into exile in England. But there are uprisings elsewhere also. In Budapest, which is right here, a nationalist leader named Louis Kossuth, he called for a parliament and self-government in the country of Hungary. Remember that within the empires like the Ottoman Empire and the Austrian Empire and the German Confederation, there are still individual countries that are being controlled by these empires. There was also an uprising here in Prague. Czech liberals demanded independence, and this happened over and over again across Europe. We see where politics are swinging back and forth, but ultimately within a year, liberals had lost all gains against the conservatives. The revolutionaries had failed to unite, and by 1849, Europe had pretty much returned to the way things were before 1848. Governments went back to doing things the way they had always been done. So there were also radicals wanting to make a difference and change in France as well. King Charles X thought that he would try to come out of exile and put the absolute monarchy back in place. Now, of course, this was a pretty big deal to the people of France. They had just gone through the French Revolution seeking democratic government. They certainly did not want to return back to the way that things had been. The attempt to put the monarchy back in place sparked riots, and it eventually forced Charles X to flee to Britain. He was replaced by Louis Philippe, who was the last king of France, because eventually, after 18 years of ruling France, the French citizens decided that he was no longer who they wanted. He basically wasn't able to gain the support of the working class. The monarchy is once again overturned, and this time a republican government is set up. So this new republic, the Third Republic, seems like a great thing, but it pretty much starts to fall apart as soon as it comes together. Here's the problem. The radicals who had wanted political change, they split into two factions or groups. One faction wanted only political reform. The other wanted not only political reform, but also social and economic reform. The results were bloody battles in the streets of Paris, which ends up turning everyday French citizens away from the radicals. Because of that, a moderate constitution was written in 1848, and in this constitution, demands were made for a parliament and a strong president elected by the people. In December of 1848, Louis Napoleon was elected by the French people to be their president. He took on the title of Emperor Napoleon the Third just 4 years after being elected. And yes, he is related to Napoleon Bonaparte. Louis Napoleon is Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew. Most people were okay with him calling himself emperor and accepted it with no complaint. They were ready for France to be stable and wanted a strong ruler who would hopefully finally bring some peace to France. Napoleon III did lots of great stuff for France, such as building railroads and encouraging industrialization. He also promoted a very ambitious public works program, and because of his policies, we see that employment decreased and France finally began to experience some prosperity again. So that's that for today. Next video, we're going to look at the unification of Italy, because they also had some issues going on there, and they do want to become one unified country. So that's where we're going next. See you then.